Hello, my name is Ralph Crystal. You all know me from other classes that you've taken. We are now going to embark on a class called Rehabilitation in Business and Industry, and this class is going to be somewhat different for you from the things that you've done in the past. We're going to be doing this class over a period of 4 weeks. The class is going to go even faster than other classes. However, we are not going to be expecting that you function in terms of having multiple discussions and multiple assignments. So it should be a relatively interesting class, and it should be a class that you find to be enjoyable and a class that you find of value. As I said, it is going to be different, and it is going to be a class that is going to have different types of materials. We are going to be doing similar things that we've done in other classes. There will be discussions. There will also be websites for you to review. We are also going to be having various types of PowerPoints for you to look at. In terms of the class, we have listed the goals and objectives in the course outline. We also have in the course outline the different things we'll be doing each week. Primarily, the first week will be devoted to a general discussion of what business and industry rehabilitation is. We're then going to go into different or common types of disabilities which are found in business and industry rehabilitation. And by the way, when I say business and industry rehabilitation, that means the same as if I say private sector rehabilitation or proprietary rehabilitation. It's all going to be the same. So those terms are interchangeable, and I just use different terms at different times, but basically it's all referring to the same thing. Then the third week, we're going to be discussing case management and process issues. And then the fourth week, we're going to be talking about vocational testimony, and we're going to be talking about legal issues, ethical issues, as well as private sector issues relating to operating a self-employment business and marketing issues. We are also going to be having assignments. We're working on the textbook will be called Private Sector Rehabilitation, Insurance Trends and Issues for the 21st Century. That was a report produced by the Mary Switzer Memorial Seminar. And in terms of the course outlines, there are going to be 2 case studies which you'll be given, and each will count for 25%, and you'll be given information on those. Then there'll be a final examination worth 30%, and then the discussion boards will be worth 20%, and that adds up to 100%. This is a class that we're using our new Blackboard System 6, and hopefully that system will give you an opportunity to see how that works. It'll be a little bit different, and so my understanding, though, is that it's supposed to be an enhancement, and there'll be a lot of things that will be easier and simpler to do. So those are some of the main introductory types of things. Again, this is a different kind of class. We're going to be talking about different issues. Many of you may not be familiar with these issues, but the purpose of this class is to give you a different perspective and to have you look at this different perspective to try to see how it fits in to the overall rehabilitation picture, because as you know, there are different areas of rehabilitation practice, and this being a different area than ones in which many of you have functioned and function in and are familiar with. As I said, there'll be one book which is a monograph from a seminar. It's not a very long book, so it should not be overly cumbersome in terms of readings. There'll be also several other postings of readings through articles, and there'll be websites for you to go to. And then we'll have 2 cases that, which are relatively short cases actually, that will ask you to focus on some business and industry issues. And then there'll be the final exam and of course the discussion board. So those are the main things in terms of the orientation to this class. Let me talk a little bit about some of the issues that are part of business and industry rehabilitation. First of all, let me go over some of the PowerPoint slides that we've prepared. The PowerPoint slides we've prepared for this class are relatively detailed, and in fact we've tried to make them so that they are not just highlights that need to be expounded upon by lectures. So we've tried to minimize these types of video lectures, and hopefully that by going through these PowerPoint slides that the detail provided will be self-explanatory, and you really won't need extensive lecturing. So we're trying to minimize the requirement that you have the video. If you do have any questions about any of these slides that are not quite clear from the slide, just email us, and we'll address that, and we'll certainly respond and try to clarify any of those points. But I will touch on some of the highlights of business and industry in rehabilitation, and I'm not going to go through each slide by slide. I'm expecting that you'll do that, but I will touch on the major points so that you'll get a sense as to what rehabilitation in business and industry is. So, to begin with, first of all, rehabilitation in business and industry deals with several different areas than public rehabilitation. Public rehabilitation is a national program, as you know. Public rehabilitation is funded by founded by federal legislation and funded by Congress and state governments, and it's a state-federal partnership. Services in public rehabilitation are based upon the consumer, the client, meeting eligibility criteria. However, in private sector rehabilitation is based more on a concept of entitlement. People are entitled to services because they belong to a certain group or a certain class. And typically when we talk about private sector rehabilitation, we're talking about the largest area would be worker compensation, injuries, people who have disabilities because of being injured on the job. Another area which can include work injuries but can include other types of disabling conditions would be people who have worked and are covered by short or long-term disability, and they are unable to work either because of a work injury in combination with some other disease or illness or injury which might have occurred outside of work. So short and long-term disability is a second area. Then a third area would be injuries that people have, such as injuries that may have occurred through an automobile accident or a slip and fall accident, and the person, because of that injury, is now unable to do the type of work that they had done previously. So the idea is to get the person back to work, and a referral is made to a rehabilitation professional. Private sector rehabilitation, as opposed to public sector rehabilitation, is funded at the state level, is legislated at the state level. In public sector rehabilitation, you can go from one state to another, and although each individual state has to develop a state plan, basically the legislation underpinning the public rehabilitation program is going to be the same. And So whatever state you go to, the basic primary eligibility criteria, the way services are provided, the nature of services, all of that in public rehabilitation is the same. On the other hand, in private sector rehabilitation, each individual state administers its own worker compensation program. And state legislators and legislatures develop worker compensation programs. So you can go from one state to another, and worker compensation can be very different, although there are certain commonalities which basically relate to providing some sort of medical treatment and money for lost time at work and rehabilitation services. Those fundamentals are all going to be in place. However, how much money someone gets and how often they get it, how long they get it for, and the degree to which rehabilitation is offered, all of that is going to be very different from state to state. And at the present time, all states do have worker compensation programs, but they're very different. Once you move into long-term disability or short-term disability and various types of injury cases that someone may have an automobile accident or a slip and fall injury, that's all covered by private insurance. And there's very little state regulation, although the states do monitor who can write insurance in those areas, but the specifics of the coverage is going to vary from insurance policy to insurance policy, and also how much insurance someone purchases. So it can be a varying level in that regard. So I think it's important to understand that private sector rehabilitation is just that. It occurs in an environment in which state legislatures will determine worker compensation, and they'll determine other types of insurance, whereas public sector rehabilitation is more of a national program. In public sector rehabilitation, we serve a variety of individuals, and those individuals have to meet the rehabilitation eligibility criteria of having a disability, having an impediment to employment, and through the provision of rehabilitation services, there's an expectation that the person will benefit in terms of employability. In private sector rehabilitation, the only people who are eligible would be people who are covered by that particular insurance. So where people work, they are covered at work by worker compensation. If they get injured on the job, the person is then entitled to some type of benefits to help them in terms of being able to get back to work. Now, it's also important to understand some philosophical differences. In public sector rehabilitation, in general, we want to help people achieve their highest level of functioning within reason. And we want to give choice to people. And there's the concept of empowering people with disabilities. And obviously, we have to look at what's realistic and what's reasonable in public sector rehabilitation. But we do want to help people achieve as much as they can. On the other hand, in private sector rehabilitation, we're applying more of a concept of insurance. And so, as you know, we all have insurance of various kinds. And if you've ever had a claim, some type of insurance claim, whether it's that your car you get into a car wreck, or your house gets vandalized or robbed, the insurance company will have a concept of replacing what was lost. Now, hopefully, we get back what was lost, but that doesn't certainly always happen. But there's a concept of roughly equal replacement value. So if you have if your car was a Toyota Camry, let's say, and the car gets totaled, then hopefully you'll get another Toyota Camry or an equivalent car. On the other hand, they're not going to say, well, because you were driving a Toyota Camry, you're now entitled to a Mercedes-Benz. That doesn't happen in private sector rehabilitation. It's so that when someone gets injured at work, the idea is not to say, well, here's a person who's worked in a factory on the factory assembly line making $15 an hour. Now we've tested you and we realize that you really have much more potential than that. So we're going to send you back to college for 4 years and rehabilitate you, and now you can become a college professor and earn $16. Well, it would be more than that, but I'm trying to make the point. And the point is that they would try in worker compensation to get someone back to an equivalent level of functioning that they had at the time of the injury. And that's really the main point. So it may not be possible for the injured worker to go back to working on the assembly line, but they would look for some sort of job that would be roughly comparable. But they would not look, as we might look in public sector rehabilitation, we would not look to see, well, gee, what else can this person do? What's the greatest or the highest level of functioning that the person can do? We would look in private sector rehabilitation to what would be roughly equivalent to what that person had before. And I'll go into more of these issues as we go along. In just some other concepts, and again, most of the information is relatively straightforward. In terms of worker compensation and in private sector rehabilitation, the main types of injuries that you'll find will be some type of orthopedic injury. A person injures his back or her back. A person develops carpal tunnel. A person develops a knee injury or has a head injury, a closed head injury, or a person develops, related to that perhaps, a mental impairment related directly to that injury or that accident. As we know, in public sector rehabilitation, we have a lot of consumers who have developmental disabilities, who have learning disabilities, who have attention deficit disorder, who have come in with mental retardation, mental deficiencies, or have various types of epilepsy or similar types of disabilities. We don't see those types of disabilities directly in private sector rehabilitation. You might see somebody with that type of disability, but that would not be the primary reason that person was referred to you. The primary reason would have been because the person injured his or her back at work doing some lifting. And it may turn out, after you've done an evaluation of the individual, that indeed they have a learning problem. That's not the reason they would be referred to you. But it becomes a factor that would need to be addressed and dealt with. So there are some different types of disabilities that are served in public and private sector rehabilitation. As I said, the primary area would be back and orthopedic impairments, carpal tunnel, hand injuries, knee injuries. Those are the types of disabilities that frequently see in worker compensation. There are also some different terms and different issues that come into play, which we'll be talking about as we go along. Now, let me just give a little bit more than we'll move into some other areas. Just some background here in worker compensation. Before worker compensation laws were enacted, and we're going back now, and it's not that important that you know exactly when they were enacted. We're going back 100 years. Before worker compensation laws were enacted, people had no recourse in terms of being rehabilitated or collecting money or having medical services provided if they were injured on the job. And a person, if they were injured on the job, would have to go to some sort of civil court and sue the employer to get any sort of benefits. If anyone's had any experience in suing people or civil court, that can take a long time. It can take It can take months and years, and you've got to get lawyers involved, and you've got to get depositions, and you've got to collect evidence, and you have to get statements and everything else. So and then when you get to court, you might find that the whole system is against the individual, and the system in civil court is against the individual because there is a notion that many jobs are inherently dangerous, and if you go to work, you accept the risk of the inherent dangerous aspect of working. Another factor that makes it difficult in civil court is the factor of people have to prove that they were not negligent, that it was solely the employer at fault, that it wasn't a co-worker who contributed to the accident, that it wasn't the fact that the worker who got injured, who injured his or her back, that person was doing everything correctly and was lifting correctly. But anything that was done where the employee who was injured has contributed to the injury is going to lessen the ability to collect. So because of all these problems, worker compensation laws were enacted. And worker compensation laws, in essence, take away a person's ability to sue the employer in some sort of court system. And the trade-off to that is that the injured person would get immediate medical treatment for the injury, and once missing, it would vary, but typically about a week's worth of work time, would be able to collect money for lost time at work, and would also be able to benefit from rehabilitation services if the person cannot go back to what they were doing before. And so worker compensation laws, in essence, asked people to give up the right to sue the employer and put the rehabilitation into somewhat of a non-adversarial type of situation, system. And so the idea is that people get immediate benefits. They don't have to wait years and years to go to court and maybe get some money, or maybe not get some money, or to find out if they're going to. That typically, unless there's some really outstanding situation in terms of questions about how the injury happened, people get immediate benefits in terms of medical services and treatment, and then rehabilitative therapies, and then they get money for lost time at work, and then rehabilitation services. So that's the trade-off that has occurred, and that's kind of where we're at today. Now, another difference in public and private rehabilitation is that in public rehabilitation, we accept the statements that the person makes. The person says that I have a physical injury. We accept those statements typically. We want that to be backed up by some medical evidence, and we want it to be backed up by some information, so we don't want to just totally accept what the person says, but we certainly want to consider what the person says in light of other information. What you'll find that in private sector rehabilitation is that even though I said a few minutes ago that private sector rehabilitation is not adversarial in the sense that if someone reports an injury, then they are typically going to be entitled to benefits of medical benefits and monetary benefits, immediate monetary benefits. It does become somewhat adversarial in the sense that there could be some question as to the severity, the degree of the injury. That's where the adversarial issue still remains. So you have, in other words, you might have differences of opinion by different physicians in terms of how disabling the injury actually is. And so that's where you have some sort of administrative adjudication process in worker compensation to make determinations as to how impaired the person is. And that can be particularly important when you might have one physician saying, well, yes, this person was injured, but this person can still go back to do the work he or she was doing before, whereas you have another physician saying, yes, this person was injured, but I don't think they can go back to do the work they were doing before, and here are the restrictions that this person has. That's where you get into the adversarial process. And in fact, that's where the rehabilitation professional comes in terms of being able to say, if a physician says that this person is now restricted to lifting no more than 20 pounds, what kind of jobs can this person do? That's where our expertise in private sector rehabilitation would come into play when there's a question or when someone doesn't go right back to work. That's where we come in. And even though it's worker compensation and other areas of private sector rehabilitation are not designed to be adversarial, sometimes they end up being adversarial just because of the nature of how the system functions. Now, I hope that to this point I've kind of made the things clear. Obviously, you'll have this video to review again if you're not certain. A lot of the points that I've covered, I'm going to go into somewhat more detail regarding how these things work. I think the main thing that I want you to think about are some of the similarities and differences that we find in public and private sector rehabilitation, and how these similarities and differences play themselves out. And those are the important things that I want you to consider, and I want you to think about from the things that I've initially said to this point.